Welcome to Dark Minds, Shattered Lives, where we expose predators, dive into the minds of evildoers, and help you and your loved ones avoid them. I'm your host, Deborah Dobbs. I'm an author and victim advocate with a reputation for rattling cages. Today's episode has some truth behind the fiction, and it also gives an example of how frustrating it can be to try to work for victims, to be in law enforcement and work hard to put someone away only to see them released and unleashed on the community. This episode was also a little frustrating because in the middle of it, I came down with something that's called cedar fever. I don't know if other states have this, but in Texas, we have these junky trees and they explode with pollen. I mean, it's violent. There's videos of it. You can look it up. And man, it got me. And there is no allergy medicine or anything that alleviates this. So you have this vast difference in my voice. I'm told I have this nice, soothing, silky, velvety voice, but I don't when I have cedar fever. It's still a good episode. It's a good story. So if you can get past that and stick with me, I don't think you'll regret it. I began writing fiction as a way to cope with my victim advocacy work. Specifically, the disappointment I and many victims experienced time and time again with the criminal justice system. So far, I've written 2 novels in a series, and some of the scenes in my stories were inspired by, not based on, but inspired by real events. One of those events was a wild arrest of a man who was fresh out of prison. Instead of seizing a second chance to live right, he resumed his role as a predator, as sadly they often tend to do. Well, that arrest happened decades before I fictionalized it, and decades after it, the officer who made the arrest became my husband. Last night, we were talking about that situation, the incident. The repeat offender received a life sentence. He worked hard for that life sentence, and we wondered what prison had the pleasure of housing him, if he was indeed still alive. Before we go into that, I'll let my husband, Wayne, tell you how that wild arrest went down.
So this incident happened back in June of 1979, June the 20th to be exact. I was a Richardson, Texas police officer. I had completed my first year of service, so I was still what they would consider a rookie. I was overjoyed with the job and worked hard every day. I thought that I was going to change the world, and I within a year or so discovered that I wasn't. But I still worked hard. And I was working evening shift that day. It was about 9 o'clock at night, and I was driving down the backside of an old strip shopping center. Strip center was probably 30 or 40 years old at this point. And I was driving down the alley behind there, making sure that all the buildings and businesses' back doors were secured. And as I pulled out past the end of the strip shopping center, I looked across the street, and there was a Baskin-Robbins ice cream store there. It was situated next to an apartment complex that was fairly large, and that was separated by a hedge line between the apartments and the Baskin-Robbins. And as I looked across there, I saw a man hiding in the hedges, and I was kind of curious about that, and I thought, why would he be hiding in the hedges beside this ice cream store? So I backed my police car up and got out so I would be able to just look around the corner of the shopping center building without exposing my police car. So I watched him for probably a minute or two, and he was, to use a Texas saying, he was hunkered down in the bushes. He was kind of squatted down and in this hedge line. And while I was watching him, a car pulled into this Baskin-Robbins ice cream store. And it was a full-size late Chevrolet or late 70s Chevrolet sedan 4-door. We would probably call it a land yacht today because they're a lot bigger then than they are now. And a teenage girl got out of the car and walked into the store. And he immediately keyed on her and started looking around in full circumference sweeps visually to see if he could see anything. And he came out of the shrubs and about half stood up, and I got a look at him and I recognized him. And his name was Frank Garrison. He had been recently paroled for an aggravated robbery. He had been out of prison for 6 or 8 weeks at this point. Recognized him because I'd had contact with him before. Also, within the previous 2 weeks in that same general area, there had been at least 1 and I believe 2 incidences where people had encountered a masked male with a knife in the back of their vehicle. One of them was a van with a bunch of girls from the YWCA that were going somewhere, and he was hiding in the van and made his appearance, and basically the driver slammed on the brakes and all of them ran away, and so did the offender. So we had a little bit of information about crimes involving a masked knife-wielding offender. So Garrison comes out, goes to the back of the car, and he's stooped down, and he's looking around, full sweeps, 360 degrees, and he reaches in his back pocket and pulls out a big piece of pantyhose and pulls it over his face for a mask. And he produces a big butcher knife from his waistband and creeps around to the left rear door of this car. And he tests the door, and it's unlocked, and he looks around completely again and opens the door and crawls in the back floorboard. At this point, I was on the radio telling dispatch and other officers that I had this felony offense in progress and who the offender was, and that I needed some backup. The dispatcher told me there was no one clear to come help me, so I continued to watch him, waiting on someone to get clear to come help me. I was also operating under the premise that Baskin-Robbins typically took forever to fill an order for somebody. And so I thought they'll take several minutes to take care of this girl's order, and I'll have time to wait. And of course, this night, they were very efficient and very quick. It turned out this girl was 18 years old, had just graduated high school, and was at the store to buy a half gallon of ice cream for her family. And I'm watching her inside the business from across the street, and I'm watching him in her car, and every minute or so, he would raise up in the back floorboard and look around and then drop back down. So I knew he was committed to victimizing her, and I was relatively certain that he intended to kidnap and rape her and possibly kill her.
How are you feeling with all this going on? You're still a rookie. What were your thoughts, your feelings, seeing what you're seeing and knowing there's no backup, there's nobody coming?
I was excited. I was scared. It sounds funny, but I was elated because I was doing the best police work I could possibly pull off. I mean, you don't get that kind of chance very often. Usually you respond to the offenses, you respond to the dead body or the victimized woman and hope that you can figure out who committed the crime. I was watching the crime from its preparatory phase and as it was getting ready to really kick off. So I was watching her inside the Baskin-Robbins. They handed her a paper sack with the ice cream, and she started out the door. And I realized at this point there was no way that I could let this get any further. So I had already jumped in my car, my police car, and basically I blasted out of the parking lot across this street.
But it was a small street. There wasn't any traffic or people to weave through or blocking your way.
It was 2 lanes wide. They were wide lanes, but it was a small street. And I pulled up and jumped out of my car as she was walking up to the front door, the driver's door of the car, and I yelled at her to get away from the car. And she looked at me like I was crazy and said, "But it's my car." And I said, "Get away from the car." And about that time, Garrison sits up in the back floorboard with his mask on, and she sees him and drops the ice cream and screams and runs into the store. And I'm still by myself. There's still no backup there. And so at gunpoint, I ordered Garrison out of the car. He gets out of the car and he's still holding the knife. And I ordered him to drop the knife, and he didn't. And so I had him at gunpoint, and I realized that if he didn't drop the knife, I was going to shoot him. And I had an imaginary line on the parking lot to where if he touched that line, I was going to shoot him dead right there on the spot. He apparently perceived what my intentions were and what my plans were for him, and he threw the knife down and proned out and stayed there. I kept him at gunpoint until finally a cover unit showed up about 3 or 4 minutes later and took Garrison into custody and transported him.
Now, I know you left out a part. Did you do that on purpose?
You talking about the embarrassing part? Yes, I did, but I'll do it now that you've prompted me. So all of this arrest was like, I was getting gold stars, 5 gold star reviews all the way across the matrix of review there on this for being there at the right time and seeing all this and taking all this action and being quite heroic almost. And when I had Garrison proned out on the ground, I knew how bad he was. I already knew his criminal background and that it was violent and that he was probably the one that had done these other intrusions into cars and scared people to death. And so what I did was, while he was proned out and when I was getting ready to handcuff him, is I just dropped a knee into his back real hard to kind of push all the air out of him and help him see where his position in life was. And that was well done. In fact, it was so well done that I didn't rip. I exploded a pair of uniform pants from the bottom of the zipper seam all the way back to the waist seam in the back. And it didn't rip. It was a boom instead of a rip. So everything was perfect except that. And that ruined the whole evening because I had to handcuff him with my tighty whities sticking out in the breeze, and there was a crowd on the parking lot when this happened that had gathered, and I had to get my raincoat out of my gear bag in the trunk and tie it around my waist to cover up my blown out uniform pants. So that was the arrest of him, and we charged him. Didn't have to go to trial. He waived the grand jury hearing.
What did you charge him with again? And what level of an offense was it?
Charged him with burglary of a vehicle, which at that time was a third-degree felony. It was punishable by up to 10 years in the penitentiary. The charging document was that he committed this burglary with the intent to commit a felony, and I think they alleged that he intended to commit a kidnapping, is what I think they put in there. So he pled guilty. This is in the summer of '79, about July. He pled guilty to burglary of vehicle and received a 7-year penitentiary sentence.
So here we are, and Frank Garrison has received a 7-year sentence. And let's back up. I've got his criminal history in front of me. We're talking old school on paper. Public records will show people's criminal history starting at the age of 18. And by the age of 18, Frank Garrison was not only showing a commitment to a life of crime, but he was also showing criminal versatility. On February 5th of 1971, when he was 18, he was arrested for burglary of a habitation. 7 weeks later, on March 25th, he was sentenced to 5 years probation. On August 17th of 1972, he violated his probation and was arrested for illegal possession of narcotics. He was sentenced to 6 years in the pen, and he did 2.5 years of that sentence, and then he was released. Then on January 23rd, 1975, pretty quick after he got out of prison, he was arrested for aggravated robbery with a deadly weapon and aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and he got an 8-year sentence for each offense to be served concurrently, of course. And the parole board decided that he was a good risk and turned him loose on the community again in May of 1979. Now, at this point, Wayne knew about this guy, and he had already made contact with him. He was watching him. Wayne said he also had a scumbag brother named Jerry. Jerry tried to complain on Wayne because Wayne would maintain a close watch on them. And within a month or two, June 1979, Wayne arrested him. So despite the criminal history he had already established and the versatility in his criminality that he had displayed, he got a whopping 7-year sentence. And despite the lengths he has gone to show the Board of Pardons and Paroles that he's not a good candidate for early release, they released him after 4 years. Actually, it wasn't quite 4 years. And he essentially does the same thing. He crept into the back of a woman's van, and this was in the middle of the day, and she's minding her business and she's going to work. And when she gets to work and parks her van, out he comes with a mask and a knife. And this time he bound her and he tried to sexually assault her. He started to. Nobody knows why, but something went through Frank Garrison's perverted little mind and caused him to run. And the victim managed to get inside of her workplace and called for help. I referred to Frank Garrison as stupid, and what I mean by that is he's stupid because he commits crimes in the city where he lives, and when he's released by the geniuses at the Board of Pardon and Paroles, he goes right back to where he committed his crimes before, and he offends again and again. That's what I mean by he's stupid. He's a stupid criminal. Thank God. And so he runs, and he almost gets away because the patrol officer that spots him, when it comes to stupidity, this guy might have given Frank Garrison a run for his money. Instead of detaining him properly, he tells him just to sit on the curb, not handcuffed, nothing, just sit on the curb. I don't know what the hell this police officer was doing, but Frank Garrison outwitted him and ran. But it didn't last long because another patrol officer with a little more intellectual capacity detained him. And this time, Frank Garrison gets 99 years for being a habitual criminal. You think? They really figured that out. He got 48 years for the robbery, yes, because he robbed her too. Now you know this guy is finally going to be in prison and not see the light of day again. Maybe 1 hour. He gets to go in the yard, right? 1 hour a day. There you go. That's enough. That's it. He earned it. I mean, he worked really hard to get that life sentence. For many years, I worked closely with law enforcement. Often I was at the scene, but I, as an advocate, had absolutely no influence over the process. I would feel the frustration of seeing perpetrators released or people with low bonds that were very dangerous, but I could only wonder what it was like to be an officer or detective that made the arrest and put a solid case together only to find out that the suspect is released, or even after convicted, given probation or given early release. Obviously, when Wayne Dobbs and I married, we had plenty of opportunities to discuss each other's perspectives and experiences. And those conversations helped me go from wondering to imagining what it's like to some degree. We were married in 2014, and I was still deep into the victim advocacy work, and he was well into retirement. As you tend to do when you end a career, you might reflect on the things you accomplished, and you might leave your career with a lot of questions. And for Wayne, I remember him wondering how much of an impact he really made, because when you get the victim's perspective through me as a victim advocate, there's so many things that you don't think about when you're in law enforcement. We have different objectives, especially back then. Law enforcement is suspect-centered. Honestly, I really think it should be. Despite the push that law enforcement might feel from victims and victim advocates, I don't agree with law enforcement becoming victim-centered. Training is important. Understanding the trauma response is essential, especially when doing interviews. But I don't think that you should shift law enforcement procedures to be 100% victim-focused. I want cops to be focused on apprehending perpetrators. I want them to get the bad guys without re-victimizing the victims, and let the victim advocates do what they do. So Wayne was hearing consistently about the victim's perspective and a victim's experience. And then he started wondering, did he ever do more harm than good? And then how much impact did he really have at all? And I kept thinking about that Frank Garrison situation and the 18-year-old who was just getting ice cream for her family, and what would have happened if Wayne had not been there. Wayne has an amazing memory. So he remembered the victim's name, and I found her. Just a simple social media, got on Facebook, did a little search and found her. And with great hesitation and humility, I reached out to her. The woman's name is Carol. She said it's okay if I use her first name. And she and I arranged a meeting and surprised Wayne. And she and her husband came. And it was healing. And that meeting was several years ago. And I got in touch with her again recently. And I told her about the podcast and that I was going to cover the incident and asked her if she wanted to participate at all. And she didn't want to come on and be interviewed. She sent me a text and gave me permission to share it with you. Reflecting on the incident, Carol said, I wasn't nearly as traumatized as I could have been, mostly because Wayne had Frank Garrison in custody before I even knew that any of this involved me. Obviously, things would have been very different had I gotten in my car. I know that the trajectory of my life would have been completely changed if events had gone differently. Overall, because of the way things played out, I was able to move on pretty easily. No nightmares or anything. Meeting Wayne was such a blessing because it kind of wrote a positive conclusion to the whole episode. That meeting took place at a restaurant that I love. We go to often, Roman Cucina, and that was in 2021. And Wayne and I were at Roman Cucina the night before we looked up Frank Garrison. We were talking about the case and meeting Carol and her husband. She seemed to had been living a really nice life, had a big family. And we don't know what happened to the other woman. I haven't found her. And we were fairly certain that Frank Garrison had died in prison. But we got home and we looked him up. And the parole board released him. And he lives in Tyler, Texas. I like Tyler, Texas. I like East Texas. I love it there. And so I'm really sorry for the good residents of Tyler that you have the likes of Frank Elam Garrison III breathing the same air as you. We can hope that Frank Garrison is incapable of committing crimes. And it's not going to be because of his age, because I don't care. You can be in your 70s and you're still going to be a pervert. Or scumbag, or dirtbag, lowlife, whatever you want to call it. You don't age out of it. Maybe you don't have the capacity to offend like you did in your 20s and your 30s, but age is not always a mitigator. And you know what, man? You earned life in prison. I don't know why they let him out. Hopefully he's incapable of committing crimes, but he's out. And that just pisses me off. Although I'm not a silver lining kind of person, while Frank Garrison did get out early, it was 36 years that he was unable to perpetrate. 36 years taken from him when he might have been crawling in the backseat of some other girl's car, and maybe he would have killed somebody. He was escalating. I think it is important that, for those who are listening, especially if you are a detective or a patrol officer or one of the prosecutors that doesn't just go for the easy plea, but really pursues justice. For y'all, I think it's important that you know the impact you make. That meeting between Wayne and Carol just reiterated the amount of good, immeasurable good, that one solid arrest or one solid conviction can do. Now, if you're living in or around Tyler and listening, you don't need to be getting pitchforks and burning stakes and finding Frank Garrison's place of residence. He's on parole. People are watching. We even notified law enforcement in Tyler to give them just a heads up. So while he's out, he's got eyes on him, and he's pretty old. But what I will say to everyone, even when you're just going in for something quick in the store, lock your doors. I still do some work in victim services. I still lead a nonprofit agency, and we have so many reports every month, not necessarily violent criminals climbing into the back of people's cars. It's more identity theft and property theft. And here's the kicker. You think that crimes like the ones committed by Frank Garrison, essentially putting on a mask, getting a knife, and climbing in the back seat of a car, waiting for a victim, it's actually a misdemeanor now. There's a kicker. So please be careful. Lock your doors. Check your back seats before you get in the car. You shouldn't have to. We shouldn't have to do that. People should just be decent and obey the law. And if you forget to lock your car, that doesn't mean that you were asking for it or you invited the problem. Not at all. It's not your fault. It's not a victim's fault. I simply remind people of this because I think we need to make it harder for criminals. We're on the same team, and you want to strengthen your team. And that's one way to strengthen your team. To remind each other, to be proactive and alert and strengthen your situational awareness. That's all. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Dark Minds, Shattered Lives. I'm Deborah Dobbs, and until next time, trust your gut and know your exits.